Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Bouvines, fought on July the 27th, 1214, near the town of Bouvines in the county of Flanders, as the concluding battle of the Anglo-French War of 1213-14 between the two armies of King Philip Augustus, right, of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor Otto the Fourth and his Anglo-Flemish allies. This battle would require an adequate presentation that we cannot give on YouTube for the most obvious reason that this is maybe not the best platform to make a thorough historical inquiry of such a huge topic as the battle, just in its broader historical meaning, but even in the tactical analysis of it. If we were to really analyze source by source, which could take like 10 videos, and it would be extremely fascinating to do, but I've never studied actually the battle in that way. Very few people actually do this when producing, for example, their entertainment videos, let's put it in this way, but it would be necessary, and also together with broader solid historical and military artistical, I would say, background. I wanted actually to make two preparatory videos to introduce the battle proper, one on the significance of the Battle of Bouvines and another on the campaign. It is also quite fascinating. This video will be, as the usual battle ones we make on Schwerpunkt, simply the tactical analysis of the battle on the base chiefly of studies. I use Verbruggen mostly, that it's an author that I'm tied to for kind of professional reasons, and that I appreciate very much, and it's an excellent source indeed. He wrote several articles. I also read others, but this is drawn from the art of warfare in Western Europe during the Middle Ages, right? That is part of this so-called Batavian school, let's say just by name, to which also De Vries belongs, etc. And it's a very good analysis, very simple, as it should be in synthesis. And this is what we will try to do today as usual. And the reason why I'm so circumstantial today, and I say it without any afterthought, is that Bouvines, to put it simple, is the single most important battle of the Middle Ages, right? For a number of reasons that mostly encompass its strategical and political consequences, as Bouvines, as a sort of billiard strike, triggered some of the single most important events in medieval Europe, especially in France, England, Germany, and Italy, and brought fundamentally to a reverse of what it could be a great part of the international policy in Western Europe at the time. And we don't have the time today to explain precisely why, but if I tell you quite simply, I will make a video about this, and we already discussed it actually on some occasion, but a more dedicated video would be definitely proper. It brought to the hegemonic rise of the Capetian monarchy in the Western Frankish kingdom, that actually becomes the Kingdom of France, even if just by name, under Philip II Augustus, that is also not called like this for no reason. It triggered the Magna Carta in England. Just saying, right? It brought to the Holy Roman Imperial throne Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, right, with all the consequences in Germany, in Italy, in Sicily. The Hohenstaufen court in Palermo was born in a way also for in European history the base, the seed of humanism, or what would become humanistic literature eventually. In Italy, it triggered an astonishing series of consequences, also for what concerns the papacy, which is often overlooked, and that managed at this point to extend its greatest control over Christendom. But aside from this, if it wasn't enough, the battle is also quite significant from a tactical point of view. Actually, It's a peculiar battle. It's not so particularly different after all compared to others, but it owns certain specific characteristics and events that, in a way, from one side, consolidate fundamentally what we know as the hegemony of feudal dominance. We could say feudal warfare, intending it that with the Capetian victory, France rose to uncontested model of political, institutional, and social level, and that basically exported also itself all over Europe, over even Germany, over Italy. It was some of the it was one of the single most ideologically, we can say, for the quality of the ideology, celebrated victory in medieval Europe, right? Actually, the appreciation of this Capetian victory in the same France was not so well received everywhere, right? For reasons that could go as just look what was happening, for example, in Occitania, or even among the same French vassals at that point had kind of considered the French monarchy, Western Frankish monarchy, as a lesser evil, right? And that had always hoped to maintain a certain degree of autonomy from the center. And in general, we could go on rambling over and over. I promise I will do it, because the symbolism even involved in this battle is very heavy, right? And one problem we'll see, and we will be able to see this even from some detail, right, during the battle. Then during the battle, there were, for example, certain symbols that were displayed, sometimes even for the first time, like the French fleur de lis, right, of the Capetian monarchy, but others in relation with the French and the Germans, and the dichotomy in the Franks and the Romans. And it was a battle for the dominance of Europe objectively. That's also why we should talk about the strategic background, in the sense that this campaign originated, the one of Bouvines, as one of the two arms of the pincer movement that actually John of England, right, John so-called Lackland, had organized pretty well, by the way, right? He had wiped out basically the French fleet, had landed in Normandy and collected this army of mercenaries, had eventually invaded Western France, and from the other side, the Emperor Otto IV of Brunswick, excommunicated at the time, because he had actually received the crown, imperial title, from the papal hands, of course, but in exchange for the refusal of the unification of Germany and Sicily, right, as that would have choked basically Italy and the papacy, right, which the Roman Church definitely did not want. So the first thing was to march on Italy and on the papal territories, and even invade the Sicilian one that was held by Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, that as you know, that the papacy had, as a family, had been fighting in the previous generations, and that now were ousted fundamentally by the imperial throne, and that's what the agreement with Otto, that was from the Welfen, right? So from the opposite side of the German political faction compared to the Swabians, had been replaced by, and this triggered in reverse instead the pro-Hohenstaufen policy of the papacy itself, right? And Frederick II, in this sense, was also allied with France, as Germany, or better, the Welfen and England at this time were allies, also married into each other's family, and were, John Lackland and the same Otto were related, and therefore had France, Capetian France, been wiped out as such. That is to say, the Angevin kings had finally seized the French crown as, vassals of the same French Western Frankish kingdom. Well, they would have basically collected the single most imposant power in Europe, right? Summing, the French and the English crown. The Holy Roman Empire also would have had, an easier time in Italy, because France would have basically not shelter the papacy anymore. So this had huge implications, and far beyond actually these boundaries, because basically whichever thing was happening in this area of Europe had major reflections all over Europe and the Mediterranean, and by far. So this is one of the single most fascinating periods in history, in my opinion. 13th century, especially. There is a terrific balance of of sources and events that can be studied with this also equilibrated. They are fairly accessible, and these figures that are frankly also we can't discuss them properly today, because today, as we were saying before, we will make just a tactical analysis of the battle. But this is just to say how much was really at stake at that point. And this really makes Bouvines as the single most important battle of the Middle Ages. I mean, there could have been others, of course, that might have changed the course of history, much more, impacting way, many ways. Think about the sieges of Constantinople, other battles that we consider sometimes we overlook, compare also to others that we definitely, overestimate in many ways. But this one definitely had such huge implications, at least for Western Europe proper, that it deserves, in especially considering the broader dominance to which the same Western Europe was rising. In that century, that is really the century of feudalism, of chivalry, of scholastic, on this system, how it had been codified in this very moment, right, that we can't avoid to give it this title. As we were saying before, the battle also presents certain tactical, let's say, episodes that are very interesting in their own kind. They also show, if you want, how in parallel to the feudal system, there were other communities that were developing, let's say, from the within, but in beyond it. In a way, we will see the role, for example, of the Flemish infantry that less than 1 century afterwards actually obtained one of the single greatest defeats of the same French during the Middle Ages at Courtrai, a victory of infantry, purely so, over cavalry and over chivalry, over the King of France, right? And this is quite important because it was a sort of reverse, right? And we will talk about that as well in a dedicated video. Another problem for the reconstruction of the battle that, of course, we have to point out unavoidably. So we are in 1214. This is a fairly early date. We don't have an excessive amount of sources, unfortunately. This is a time in which Western European historiography is starting to produce more in more critical terms, and definitely we're fairly well documented for this battle, considering the times and spaces, but at the same time there are substantial difficulties in its reconstruction, or better, we mostly don't know exactly how many troops participated from one side and one other. We don't have a completely clear idea of how troops were disposed at which point. That there are many discrepancies. I mean, it's not a battle that could have gone like that the sources suggest could have gone in a completely different way, but we still lack that amount of information to really understand what happened for most of the battles, historically speaking. It's really the same thing. And it's also a battle that we know from the French celebrating side, definitely as a consequence of the same victory, which is not so banal to say, in the sense that it was immediately realized what this battle had produced. Right? Sources written, think about Mosquet, but even more than 30 years later. It's the royal chaplain Guillaume de Breton that actually produces the two main works on the battle, and that offers the greatest amount of details. And there are interesting articles online you can find on Perse, for example, or academia.edu, that if you just type bataille, they're in French actually, but I think many of you can read that. That show mostly, rather than the tactical development of the battle, that, as we were saying now, we mostly draw from Verbruggen, try to make sense of the rationalizing, sometimes positivistic attitude that we have when we go analyzing this battle. And this is the same problem I told you before, right? Even if you find reconstructions online or videos and things like these, of course, most of the times there's going to be a simplified version of the historical problem that we have in assessing what really happened. Of course, we have sources that contradict each other. For example, we don't know exactly which tactics were employed, and therefore we have a somewhat sketchy picture of the war, and some overall based on certain conjectures. I mean, that are important because, I don't know, just yesterday we were making that video on the Filmkrieg talking about the importance of numbers, right? If we just have problems with numbers here, the analysis of the battle is going to be somewhat altered, right? We have to accept mostly that what we get from the sources is of course not the truth as such, because no source, historically speaking, is ever going to tell you the truth ever. If you search for the truth, do not study history, because that's paradoxically not how it happens, even if you can still get to the better results through the historical method in that sense. But here we have in fact to look at the historical reality with certain philological, linguistical, military logical analysis that overall is it's difficult to acquire. So even today's video, as long as it will surely be, unfortunately for those who wish my videos to be shorter, we will not be able to cover fully, right? And we mostly agree with in outline with what some of the major scholarly authorities, on the base of sources, of course, arrived to state. And there are interesting coincidences in here, just in what seems a purely speculative method and actually the data offered by the sources, etc. What we will skip a bit actually will be the composition of the two armies in detail. Now, of course, we're going to tell what it is, but as we will see now, one of the most difficult things is to even understand what these armies were composed like, right? Where exactly infantry stood, or where cavalry did, and how they were arrayed, which tactics, and so on, how many there were, and so on. So I would start by simply present. So we will see naturally these difficulties all along. So without too many other ramblings on this. So the strategical situation here is that basically Philip II had managed to essentially defeat the army of John of England at the siege of Roche-aux-Moines in Anjou, where the future Louis VIII, known at the time as Louis the Lion, Philip II's son, had been sent by his father with this detachment of 800 knights to assist the defenders that were well organized. And at that point, John basically had to abandon the siege with all the machinery and so on. So basically, Philip at this point was free to deal with the Anglo-German force. I will say Anglo-German for simplicity. Of course, there were the Flemish as well. But at this point, we see what we mean with the remaining French army that originally was 2,000 knights and obviously some amount of infantry. We don't really know at this point, and that without Louis the Lion now was at 1,200. So this is usually the number that is said to have been brought even at the Battle of Bouvines it was developing, right? And the war in the county of Flanders had been raging furiously, right? There were entire cities destroyed, like Ypres by the same French. There were devastations. I mean, all you can imagine in warfare in this regard. And basically, Philip at this point wanted to meet, of course, the Anglo-German army of Otto IV. Otto had come to France with a relatively few forces. We think around 350 men, right, mostly knights. He had gained reinforcements only from Lorraine, right, and he was basically a host in the Flemish army, right? The Flemish had fielded, their amount of cavalry and also a substantial amount of infantry, right? As you know, the Flemish cities already at this point were, providing this kind of troops more than other places in Europe. Plus, and they were cited by the knights, the mercenary knights of the Count of Salisbury, right? So these were English mercenaries, and the whole thing, right, had been paid by England. In fact, this is what would seed even the resentment of the English barons for the taxes, that they had to pay to John, and that eventually with the failure in the campaign will trigger the Magna Carta and all the various the later developments, etc. So this is kind of a repeated plot historically. I mean, Germany in this sense had failed to become a centralized monarchy, right? So unlike France and England, like the Germans now, the German emperors mostly relied on their private assets, right? And this broader kind of communitary politics of the German kingdom that whoever wanted to participate did, but for interest, and especially fighting outside the German borders, a very few locals actually sided the king. That, by the way, at this time was also not very well received by the German nobility as a whole because of how he had behaved in Italy and so on. And so actually all the money here had been provided by the English, and the Count of Salisbury had, together with other mercenaries, there were also Frenchmen in the Anglo-German army, by the way, some dispossessed noblemen that had suffered fundamentally with the Capetian expansion, and that had been unloyal to Philip, and that were the English component was that provided actually the bulk of the knights in this sense, some of the vast professional troops that to press, because the English money were finishing. So part of the reason now is we'll see that will bring even to it is considered to have brought to defeat one factor at least was the haste with which the Anglo-German army gave battle. So this was more or less the situation. The French relied instead on a much more compact, let's say, national army, in the sense that if you look at the composition, these were all French vassals and French communes, right? So it was a well equipped, supplied army, and we know from the accounts that it was fairly orderly and cohesive, right? Differently from the Germans, the Flemish, and the English in that case. But also we shouldn't stereotype too much. I mean, the differences in this regard, because after all they were fairly similar armies, right? As we will see now, we have even a difficulty in tracing but the actual differences were, and they were similar also just from a numerical point of view, for example. And so the movements that brought to the battle, basically, to make the long story short, the French wanted to attack a city. They saw that the route we're following was marshy, and they knew that the Anglo-German army was around. Actually, they had passed pretty close to each other, but they hadn't met, and they knew at that point that the Anglo-Germans were marching towards them, and therefore they came back to return to the city from another route. And from this movement, then the Anglo-Germans took the idea of attacking the French, because now, on July the 27th, we were really very brutally concise about the strategical background in here, but for what concerns the battle, also, it's relatively ininfluent. And basically, the French army had arrived to Bouvines, where there was a village today. It's basically Bouvines is close to Tournai. It's in France at the time, in County of Flanders, but it's like a few kilometers away from the Belgian border. It has, I think, today 700 inhabitants, right? And at the time it had even less. So it's this completely insignificant place. Like some of the greatest battles ever fought actually took this very random places where they were fought. And Bouvines was basically on the bank of the Marque River, and it had a bridge on it. So basically, the French were crossing the bridge from east to west in the opposite direction from what they had come from, basically, and the Anglo-Germans were coming instead from the east, from the direction of Tournai. Right, and this area, even as you can see in the map later on, we'll talk about the battle. That the map will be very evident, or I don't know whether I will have scattered it around the video. It's fairly, not much has changed really from those times. So you can see basically Bouvines is at a sort of this end of a complex area that is delimited by these marshes all around this, also wooded hills around the waters, and is crossed by this former Roman road. And the Anglo-Germans actually were coming from this minor road that right from the southeast, right into the Roman one, and that's where basically they arrived and they deployed Bouvines. And you can see the distances here. The battle was fought over. It was fought on the sides, right? It was not fought in depth. So the front line was very extended. It was basically 2 miles. And the battlefield is, basically the same distance, 2 miles from Bouvines as well. Here I simplified a lot of things in the map, also because of the uncertainties that we have. Like I found some wargamistic maps that were very neatly done, but I think they were too neatly done in the sense they seemed to know too much about how the army was really composed, and actually instead we have many doubts regarding that. So I really simplified everything, just pointing out where the cavalry was, where the infantry was, as far as we understand. And then on the composition and on the numbers, we can be more cautious, also because most of it is basically conjectural. When you find the numbers attached to, there were fundamentally 3 ranks. The formation was, we'll see it later, with a center and a left and a right wing, but they were basically all of the comparable size, and all these ranks were actually split into minor parts that were the subunits of cavalry, sometimes of not more 50 knights, right, more than 50 knights, and each corresponding to one lord that is identified sometimes in these reconstructions were a certain amount of troops, because certain studies, including Verbruggen, have basically looked at certain documents from years before, where it's written about the military feudal obligations of these various houses to the French king, and therefore it said more or less it had to be the same number. That's as vague as it is, but it's probably also not very distant from the truth, because if we sum up all the contingents that we see, especially cavalry, about which we have more precise numerical data, we see that they actually coincide with the overall numbers given by the sources. So it's actually an interesting method, and it's probably correct in general. It just we can't demonstrate it fully. So that's how simply I have sketched the battlefield, but later on we'll talk a bit better about the composition in detail. So just for telling you how the thing unfolded, basically the Anglo-Germans were undecided on what to do initially, because first of all, this seems strange, but actually for the time it was not. July the 27th, 1214 was a Sunday, and it was forbidden for Christians to fight on that day. And Otto, that was theoretically, as Holy Roman Emperor, the commander-in-chief of the army, but still, depending on his allies, didn't want to compromise further his condition and excommunicated to fight on such a day. But as we were saying before, William Longsword, Earl of Salisbury, and also Hugues de Beauve, that was this other French knight, pushed right from the English side to join battle, right, and not to spend other English money further in this. And the other commanders were fundamentally okay about it. The idea was that since the French were crossing the river, they were split, right? The columns were very long. We're talking about kilometers, right? The same Anglo-German one was seemingly 6 kilometers long without carriages, right? Without counting the carriages that of course were there. So this was of course one of the most delicate situations. And at this point, the French didn't expect the Anglo-Germans to be that close, right? They were actually, we know it from the sources, proceeding quite speedily because they were well ordered, and of course they were, in a war zone, so the situation was potentially dangerous. But they didn't actually expect the Anglo-Germans to be that swift, to arrive so speedily on the battlefield, right? And this is one of the reasons actually for which, as we will see probably, not the entire Anglo-German army was deployed when the battle began, right? Because especially the infantry remained possibly even up to 1 hour of march behind, right? And at the moment of the crossing, Philip's army was basically, of course, split in two. And that's what the most, dangerous situation is in this conditions. He hoped to cross the river to feel safer, to find a ground where was most better suited for his cavalry, and he had left in the rear guard of his army, so in the most important part in this movement, the very skilled bishop of Senlis, Guérin, that was a former Templar, right, and had gained his military experience in the Holy Land, and as you know, at this time was quite troubled. Jerusalem had fallen, but the Templars exactly in these years were perfectioning their tactics, also thanks to the encounter, let's say this way, with Turkish warfare. And at the point that this is considered, and this is broadly speaking, even if you look at the Battle of Muret fought the year before, and by Simon de Montfort, etc., this last process of perfection of feudal warfare, and specifically of chivalric tactics, right? The 13th century is basically this acme reached by feudal warfare that will be maintained as a standard, throughout all the feudal history, if you want, in this regard, but that during the 13th century was really unmatched on the battlefield, which included also attacks from the flanks, as it was seen in Moray, in fact, in southern France, but it would be seen at Lincoln Fair, etc., even at Bouvines, as we will see in a while, even if on somewhat as minor scale. But especially it emphasized the coordination and the order and the discipline of all the various cavalry units, right? In this case of the Templars, but that, as we've seen, were fundamentally replicated in a pretty identical way even in the other armies. And the French were, in this sense, somewhat most advantaged, right? Mostly, the monastic military orders of this, the Templars, the Auxiliaries, were mostly French. They had the Templars had all this enormous amount of houses scattered all over Europe, but chiefly in France. And the Western Frankish warfare in general had been dominating European tactics. In this sense, Western European tactics, at least as a model, as an example. As we've always recalled, northern France especially had this most highly stratified system where the knights were really an elite, where there were lots of people working for a single person, right? The wealth was really concentrated in the hands of very few people, so this conferred actually an enormous amount of resources for war in that sense at that specifically professional level of the knights, that therefore had a very high collective training, that in the Western Frankish kingdom was surely the highest in Europe, and that provided therefore this idea of French cavalry, that is the model, the acme of this type of warfare, let's say. And of course this system had been spreading outside since the time of Charlemagne, we could say. It's just that France reaches the top of of the limit, if you want, the perfectionment of this system in this very century, right? And eventually it will spread also gradually in countries like, I don't know, in Germany, right? For example, German cavalry. Now it's an issue even in the reconstruction of Bouvines. You know, how skilled was actually German cavalry in terms of actual collective training compared to the Western Frankish, to the French one, right? Many people said this reconstructions tend to say, well, probably we're quite the same. Yes, in terms of individual knights, sure. Maybe the Germans as individual knights were even better. The point is that collective training was not achievable in that scale that existed in Western Francia as in Eastern Francia for a simple reason of, you know, different of political fragmentation, different distribution of resources, and therefore this might have been a factor, as we will see. And Guérin was also, the Bishop of Senlis, was also, is considered, let's say, the tactical commander-in-chief of the army, right? Philip had probably entrusted him the command of the army from a tactical point of view, and especially given him this task of rearguard in this very extremely delicate moment of the river crossing. Now, what happened is that the Flemish that constituted the avant-garde of the Anglo-German army at this point, guided by the Ferrand of Portugal, Count of Flanders, had arrived at the plain of Bouvines, and had begun to engage actually with Flemish knights, infantrymen, including pikemen and crossbowmen, with the French rearguard. So at this point, Guérin distinguished himself because he managed to fence off 5 skirmishes in a row, and at a point he left the rearguard in command of the Duke of Burgundy, to actually warn the king that very likely the Anglo-Germans had arrived, right, in force, and they were threatening the French army committed in the crossing. And just thinking even in terms of reconnaissance, right, you know, it's not easy when it means of the time to understand these things, but skilled military men like the Bishop of Senlis surely knew what was going on, had seen the pressure mounting, enemy troops were coming forward again and again, pressure was increasing. So at that point, Philip and the rest of the French command didn't listen to the bishop, right? They said, we must continue the crossing. We already started it. They were sending the communal infantry through the bridge at that point, and the bishop insisted, but he was sent away. Right then, at that point, it was a hot day. Right, the battle was fought actually a bit after noon. Right, so at this point during the crossing, the king of France, took off his armor. He found a nice spot under in the shade under a tree close to the church of Bouvines, and he had a snack. So while he was eating, he was annoyed by a messenger that came once again from the rear guard and said that the imperial army was coming in force at that point, and that the situation was critical. So at that point he understood. He wore again his armor. He prayed briefly in the church, and he gave the order to prepare for battle. Right. So this is very interesting because if you look at the condition of the two armies, basically both were stretched. The Anglo Germans for the long march, the French because they were split in two across the Marque River, and therefore both of them actually were not in full, let's say, perfect order and strength. Right, the French were, however, probably advantaged at this point because their organization was probably better. They had been more prudent. They had been speedy but still orderly, and therefore they decided themselves now to risk everything. in a pitched battle. And this actually caught by surprise the same Anglo-Germans, because the French basically deployed in the plain of Bouvines, facing east. This is an important detail also because after noon the sun was at their shoulders, while actually in the face of the Anglo-Germans, and the latter, when they arrived, they met basically with the French army drawn in front of them. This is very important. The emperor. As far as I understand, they I don't know how they actually deployed, because the Flemish were on the left flank from the side of the road from which they had come. So probably had to do some complex maneuver to surpass the Flemish contingent and to deploy at their side. The French forces totaled between 1,200 and 1,300 knights. Verbruggen says 5,000 to 6,000 infantry, which is possible. Thomas de Saint-Valery said to have brought, when it was a nobleman, French army, to have brought even 2,000 infantrymen. According to a source, was a bit too much. But let's say the numbers can't be that, or possibly even less, actually. Maybe 3,000 infantry. We don't really know. There are some sources, including, if I'm not wrong, William de Breton, that says that the enemy, the Anglo-German army, was of, could say Anglo-Saxon, considering that Otto was, from Braunschweig, the Welfen reigning from Saxony in Bavaria. But aside from this, the enemy army was like 3 times more, right? It is to exclude. Right, and we have other French. We actually more in detail about the French numbers than the Anglo-German ones. But the idea is possibly that 1,200 and knights and 6,000 knights, infantrymen, is the number of French force overall. The Anglo-Germans probably weren't that many more, right? Some say they had up to 1,500 knights. We don't really know, right? And the fact that the Anglo-German column was so stretched, it doesn't help us in this regard. And it's probably not even the most important factors, but just about, as we will see now, the disorder probably. Another source, if I'm not wrong, says 1,300. You know what? It's possible that actually the French and the Anglo-German forces had more or less the same number of knights. After all, possibly the Anglo-Germans were, however, superior in infantrymen, right? Thanks especially to the Flemish contribution, to the Flemish cities. Arras had the larger contingent. I think was like 1,000 men, if I'm not wrong. But anyhow, the Anglo-German infantry is counted at possibly even up to 7,500, right? So a substantial amount more of the French forces. So as you understand, it's a fairly symmetrical situation, right? And in all of this, we have to consider, though, that what we didn't say in here is that we said knights, but actually just probably half of the French mounted forces were actual knights, right? The others being sergeants. Some people say, the sergeants were also on foot, but technically in this sense, of course, were sergeants on foot as well, but probably, half of the French cavalry forces were actually light cavalry, right? Not knights. So actually the number of knights would get down to 600 for both sides. Right, and just consider it, because it's if you do the maths, strange things come out. The problem is that we don't really know how many troops were deployed where. Right, that's why I didn't make a more complex picture of the battle, because we really don't know, and we can assume they were fairly well distributed. Also, because when the Anglo-Germans arrived, as we have seen, the French were already arrayed, but as the enemy troops kept coming, the French basically widened the front. So this, together with other witnesses, basically brings to say that the French were outnumbered, at least by some margin, and needed to widen the front to meet the enemy forces, more especially on the right flank. the French right flank. And if you look at the composition of the army in here, the units were disposed more or less in that way. So Otto IV of Brunswick, Holy Roman Emperor, arrayed his troops on the top of a small hill at the center of the field. He had probably both cavalry and infantry, right? But as we'll see now from the battle, probably the cavalry were not so many. He had a few good German guards, right? But we will see probably there was a somewhat substantial contingent of infantry that is credited to have been deployed at his rear, right? Because he at least charged in through the as we'll see later, into the French infantry in the front. And consider that at this point, we'll see it better when we talk about the French deployment, but in front of him he had Philip II himself, right? And the French infantry arrived when the battle was basically beginning and arrayed in front of the king. So that's when Otto eventually charged to them. And these were fundamentally, Otto had German Lorrainese troops as such. Then the Allied right wing was composed fundamentally by the English contingent, right? So the Anglo-German right was composed by essentially the English knights and especially Flemish infantry that were deployed, as far as we know, in circles, right? Not in squares like probably the other infantry was, but in circles that were used by the commander-in-chief, that was Renaud de Damartin, as a sort of mobile base, right? Or better, the infantry was probably stationary, but basically the circles could open, and the cavalry that was inside of this formation, so probably there weren't many knights, but that is kind of obvious, could make these sorties, as we'll see now, and attack the French cavalry they found in front of them, as we will see, and then come back within these circles. Now this tactic is fascinating because it's not common, right? But it shows this still important coordination that existed already at the time between cavalry and infantry, right? That will never come to end throughout even the 13th century, where there was the acme of knightly warfare. And the Flemish pikemen are also, they had their reputation already at that time, and were considered some of the finest infantries in Europe. Still, at this point, not able to actually gain a victory in open field against heavy cavalry. So the function of infantry in this century still, and especially in this century, was just the one of auxiliary role, right? As the knights were the protagonists, and infantry alone, up to the beginning of the 14th century, will not make it to win a battle, right? So together in this right, there were this mercenaries from Brabant, actually, I think, supporting Renaud de Damartin, that was the Count of Boulogne, by the way. Then William Longsword, Earl of Salisbury, and Hugh de Boves, right? So we don't know. I think that the sources says that just Renaud de Damartin was operating with the Brabançon mercenaries in that form. They were probably around 400, 700, something like that. We don't know about the Earl of Salisbury or the Boves, but it's actually possible that they were supported in the same way, if not by the same circular formation of infantry, but still definitely by infantry. Actually, there is a problem of interpretation in here, because according to many scholars, including Verbruggen, what appears from these sources is actually that the infantry in both armies in here was present, just let's say in the central divisions and in the right Anglo German and in the left French one, right? So the two divisions confronting at the south end of the battlefield theoretically would have been just cavalry. Now, it is true that indeed we do not get any evidence of infantry in the southern divisions, let's call it in this way, but it's definitely possible that infantry was present there as well, right? It wouldn't be strange. I mean, it actually makes a lot of sense. All of these knightly forces that composed basically all the divisions of the battle needed some sort of sheltering of protection of this stationary shield wall, and even support for crossbowmen that probably ran back and forth, harassing the enemy cavalry from between a charge and another, right? So this is just a matter of say, okay, we don't get it from the sources, but there wouldn't really be anything strange about it, right? And it actually would increase the resilience of cavalry that, as we will see, especially actually on the southern divisions, fought for a very long time, over 3 hours, right? So if you really don't have any support in the rear, this is even more, astonishing. And even though knights were used to such things, but it would have been preferable to have this contingent. Also because, in fact, the knights also brought from their thieves infantry together with cavalry. So, given, as we will see now, that in the, for example, especially in the French right, we have a somewhat spot-on composition of at least of the noblemen who took part in it. I mean, there wouldn't be anything strange to think there were infantries there, right? And not there were arrayed somewhere else, right? At least we don't know, simply. And we don't know how the thing is gone. What we know, for example, as we were saying before about the French infantry, is that it arrived when the battle was basically beginning and deployed in front of the French king's cavalry, right? But what about the others? Was that all the French infantry? Probably not. Right, so this is the picture that we get, more or less. For concluding instead the Anglo-German array, on the left, there was probably what is considered the largest amount of the forces. The same is true, actually, I think, even for the French. In fact, the main battle, especially probably the nightly one, was more intense in this area. So, as we were saying before, the Anglo-German left was composed by the troops of the Count of Flanders. So there was mostly Flemish cavalry, right, from Flanders, from Hainaut, etc. We're talking about substantial amount of troops, possibly even the absolute majority, and the rest of even more than 1,000 cavalry. We don't know, but it's as high as that, maybe. It's just that the battle accounts give a great importance to the cavalry battle on this southern end, and therefore we get the impression that the majority of troops were somewhat concentrated, of mounted troops were concentrated in there, while we have, kind of a greater role of infantry in the other places. But as we were saying before, we don't have, I presume, any direct evidence of this. Passing to the French forces, we get basically a specular array. So the center was composed by Philip Augustus, King of France, with his royal bodyguard, and as we have said already twice, in front of his cavalry he stationed his French infantry, communal infantry, that by the way brought the oriflamme, that was the symbol of Saint-Denis, and more properly of the French of the French dynasty proper. This is important because Philip Augustus instead wore for the first time at this point the fleur de lis, that instead symbolized in an anti-Angevin sense the unity of the French kingdom. Right, as you know, that was the huge deal. The fact that the so-called English were actually French in this regard, and vassals of the French king, and for their French fiefs. And the whole thing of the last generations had been that the English kings had inherited basically more than half of French territory, and an enormous amount more than what the same French king had. So the Philip Augustus had been able to recover a lot of land, including Normandy and this other western regions, from John of England, and now that the whole war was taking a bit this kind of character of really making this the unity of the Western Frankish kingdom and the Kingdom of France sanctioned once for all. So this center, it was composed like this, and it's interesting because there is an asymmetry in this regard, because the French center had infantry in the fore and cavalry in the rear, right? Whereas the German center had the cavalry in the fore with Otto himself, and the infantry in the rear, right? As we'll see now, that probably made the things go in a specific manner. The French left was composed, presumably surely by knights, probably a few hundreds, and presumably infantry, right? And it contained the units of Thomas de Saint-Valery, Guillaume III, Count of Ponthieu, Robert III, Count of Dreux, Philippe de Dreux. There was also Bishop of Beauvais, and there were these two brothers within the same contingent, and Pierre II de Courtenay, Count of Auxerre. The French right, instead, was brought under the command of Guérin, right? So this part of the formation was the one on which probably the French counted the most, right? The center was, of course, with the king bodyguards. The infantry was a tough nut to crack. But the right, as we have seen also for the Anglo-Germans, was probably the most important part. I mean, the Anglo-German left specularly in front of them, and probably contained the majority of French knights and also cavalry forces in general. It was expected from Guérin to perform some of the most sophisticated tactics that, as we have seen, the Templars had been developing on their own. And this the French right was composed by various knights, and including the units of Guillaume I, Count of Sancerre, Adam II, Viscount of Melun, Mathieu II, Count of Montmorency, Gauthier III de Châtillon, Count of Saint-Paul, Jean, Count of Beaumont, then Aude III, Duke of Burgundy, right, and Pierre de Remy, plus of course the troops of Guérin. And also we get actually an explicit information from the course of the battle, as we will see, about the presence of light cavalry proper in the French right. Right, there was stationed probably in the front of the knights, at least on a part of the detachment, 150 to be more precise, and we don't know exactly how the troops were arrayed in this sense, because we have an information from, I think, Guillaume de Breton that said explicitly that Guérin had deployed the troops to, let's say, spread out, as we have seen, on an extended line to, essentially meet the enemy numbers in that regard, on two ranks, right, with the bolder, the more audacious in the front, and the less courageous in the rear. Right, this can be interpreted in different ways, and there is an explicit notation that says that although the French right was, had a fairly, a broad front. The troops, the knights were individually capable still of covering each other on the sides. Now, what does this mean? To me, actually, I haven't studied the sources, so I can't really tell it. But it sounds like, to someone at least, that it was like a unique line, right? A unique and interrupted front. To me, it doesn't sound completely right in this sense. In my opinion, it's more likely that, especially confronting with the Templar statutes and what kind of tactics also would make sense in that situation, that still the units, the cavalry, were operating in those small tactical units of essentially some tens together. So individually, as actually thickly packed formations, also with more than one knight in a row in the rear. So in this sense also, I don't know whether there were actually two different ranks with consequently two different subunits in depth of knights, right? One in front, one in the rear. Considering the one in front to be the bolder, according to the sources, and the one in the rear the least courageous. I say this because there are certain practices in feudal warfare to see, a front line of kind of elite shock troops that had the task of piercing through the enemy lines. Now, if this was the case, the French numbers were not excessive, as we've seen. Possibly these troops were even less altogether than the Flemish ones in the front. The idea is that if you kind of create this line, basically you lose the advantage of collective training, right? And even if you want to send kind of individual knights in the front, like these elite troops chosen among the others, you're basically sending them alone, right? Just to pierce through to, like in a suicidal style. According to me, it's not really like this. I mean, probably the front was spread at the point that the various units were, however, still, well balanced, right? And, distanced in a way that could still support each other, but were pretty solid. And possibly there was a second rank, or even the second rank maybe means, that there were, maybe this is just an hypothesis, should read the sources technically, but there was also this practice of using the cunei, right? These wedge formations, for which, of course, the best troops were put in the outer side and in the front, like in the tip of the spear, and the others within, kind of less courageous. It's a possibility, but I'm not sure. But what is more fascinating and kind of clearer, however, as we will see now in the tactic, is the use of light cavalry actually in the very front of the other knights to go soften up the enemy lines in what was actually a suicidal row, right? But that served probably to tire and disorder the enemies were already disorderly on their own, right? This is what appears from several sources that say that the Anglo-Germans had come so hastily on the battlefield that they hadn't had much of a time to order themselves in a common way, right? And the sources also tend to stress the fact there was much less unity of command in the Allied army, if anything for its own composition, but also probably because of all the various, think about the Flemish contingent, I mean all these various cities and lords that had been brought together under a not such an enormously powerful rule. Actually, the County of Flanders was undergoing a gradual crisis over time. In there is the idea that after all this this army overall wasn't particularly united in command, at least, or in spirit, or there were also people coming from different places. So we don't know much more compared to this, but I think now we can simply pass to the battle and see how it went. So the battle began by the detachment of 150 light cavalry on the French right. These troops came from the Abbey of Saint-Médard, right? And the aim of these troops was to soften up the enemy lines, to disorder them, and to increase further, therefore, the the lack of unity of the Flemish wing. So at this point, something very interesting happened, because the Flemish knights, while being charged by these lighter horsemen, so from non-knights, so for people that were not their peers, didn't charge against them, right? They basically took this charge in without countercharging. Now, this is, I wouldn't say, it's possible, considering the kind of moral standards that existed at the time. The idea of a knight being charged by a non-knight is ridiculous. This knight would prefer, even, with the risks deriving it from, just take the cavalry charge in. And you know that cavalry, by definition, cannot defend unless it dismounts, which becomes infantry. So even if this was light cavalry, still, it launched itself very courageously, right? This was something rare to see, exactly because it was a suicidal task, because the knights were tougher and would dispense of these guys easily, right? But still taking losses, still heating up, and still, disordering themselves in turn, right? Also, the idea that this light cavalry was, devoid of any armor, probably in the sense of metal armor, maybe, but it's not really said, right? Maybe they didn't have the full panoply, but maybe they were still equipped in a less than hopeless way, and they obliged at least part of the knights from Hainaut and Flanders to dismount, right, to fight on foot or to retreat, because there was, as we were saying, no way to respond in that regard. And there was, in this sense, I would like to make you picture the idea of cavalry formations here that were forming this, let's call them, division is improper because that includes also the cavalry and the infantry, but the ranks, the so-called ranks, the acies in Latin, in the sources. These groups fundamentally of hundreds of knights that fought as all together in various subunits, but that fundamentally were meant to hold the line in the specific side, front of the division, etc., and to lead the fight, right? So the idea is that at this point in history, albeit these troops, as we have seen before, had a fairly good collective discipline, and they fought in a cooperative, synergic way, they were still devoid of a central command. That they weren't as disciplined in the sense of acting literally all together in coordination with others under a single command, discipline for that, right? The idea is that especially the fight between knights had to proceed like in tournament style, right? With this line where the squires would wait, with new arms and horses and water for their masters, and the masters charged all together with their, in this single units, like we're talking about, 20, 30, 40 men together that came from the same place, from the same fief, but that as this tactical unit behaved fundamentally independently. And the line held, right, and the clash went on as all these various parties of knights in a sort of kind of elegant ballet, as it's described in the sources here, that of the battle, that remarked this was one of the most beautiful cavalry clashes, even just to watch, because think objectively, even at just of the colorful of the scenario. These were really some of the most picturesque clashes in the history of mankind, and the whole clash would go on with this series of back and forth, effectively to hammer the enemy lines and see which was the weaker, and eventually find a gap, break through, and make the enemy line collapse gradually. Right. So this was a very tough testing ground, yet everybody behaved a bit in a singular way, and not literally in the sense that these were not, medieval battles were not a series of duels. Everything was fought in tactical units. These tactical units could be, in fact, as we've seen, a few tens of people. And in fact, we know here that after the attack of the 150 light cavalry from the Abbey of Saint-Médard, a few of the Flemish knights left their ranks, right, the ranks of their division, to join battle with the enemy knights, right? And Walter of Gistel and Baldwin Buridan also unhorsed a few of the light cavalrymen and then proceeded on. So they went through. Buridan cheered also on the others by shouting to them to think at their lady loves and of the tournament, right? These people saw it really as a tournament, right? Tournaments, especially at this time, were actually nothing different from battles, right? People, got killed, and conversely, battles were like tournaments, so that there was a sort of, kind of sporty side of the story. I said there was an ideal, right? There was this sense of, everybody more or less knew each other. From the coat of arms, everybody went out there to show off, right? And to risk pretty brutally in the process, not just to be killed, but you just think about the massive amount of fractures that happened this time, for people falling from the horses, etc. regularly. It will happen, as we'll see now, even for Philip and Otto. So you can imagine for the rest of the knights. Here it says to think about their lady loves. So also this, broader, competition for women, and this ideal, it was probably the one of the tournament, right, and of the chivalric ideal that was forming. Naturally, this is what we get from the sources. Now, the reality of warfare is much more brutal, right? We can't think, as we were saying before, that especially the presence of infantry made things more difficult than it seems, right? The word crossbowmen probably around, the idea that knights may even take each other as prisoners, but crossbow bolts will not, right? So you have to die. Of course, they were armored in a decent way that could stop most of bolts, but it was still a pretty risky enterprise. And even the same knightly clash wasn't devoid of mortal risk, as we'll see in a while. So this thing began. So the clash begins to lighten up. We don't know, if everything started in contemporary all over the battlefield, but it seems at least the sources emphasize the fact that at this point began the attack on the south side, and it was characterized mostly as an equestrian clash, right, in the full chivalric style. In a way, this area of the battlefield is the symbol of 13th century warfare, exactly. Also, Arnulf, Burgrave of Rhess, and Eustace of Machelen, Reyes of Gavert, and others distinguished themselves in these actions. So you have to imagine even the clash on this between the French right and the Flemish left went on for 3 hours. So you can't think that this was not an attack en masse. As we were saying before, it was this continuous back and forth, and everybody was therefore able to see what others did in the process, right? So it was really a way of showing off, but also naturally testing the enemies on their the strength of the enemy line, where it was the stronger, the weaker. And in general, it seems that the French, as we'll see now, were better prepared, right? The general charge, however, was still in sight, right? And this thing, every cavalry clash, if you want, began like that, or better. Ideally, Western warfare was growing but had already grown in the sense that, of course, the attack en masse must be the decisive one that arrives, especially at the end, where the sources are basically stretched at the maximum, and you can wipe out the enemy in a single blow, taking even counting an exhaustion, right? So all this was a sort of preparatory combat, right? And sources tell us that, especially among the Flemish, there was a somewhat great disorder, right? Everybody charged as they wished. They took this in a kind of an easy way, right? So that the battle proper, right, with the mass movement of the collective movement of a formation began with the division from Champagne, right? The knights of which put the imprudent Flemish nobles out of action or took them prisoner. So this movement of the Champagne Knights is important because it somewhat broke through the Flemish line, right? And this was definitely a pretty serious thing. So this means that the French were more cold-blooded than the Flemish, had waited for this. They had probably participated, of course, in the clash with some, especially in the preparatory phase. It was the younger knights, those that had already, knighted on the field usually of battle, to clash with the others in the front. Sometimes we have evidence from 13th century sources and others that, especially when other ranks were committed, usually when there was a deployment in depth, these newly dubbed knights started literally playing tournaments in front of the lines while the others were fighting. The other rank was fighting, right? So here, naturally, some French had joined, but it seems that this right wing under Guérin was very well drilled, very well cohesed, and when the Champagne unit charged, the Flemish didn't hold and broke, at least on a part of the line. Then the Count of Flanders himself attacked with his wall formation, right, and flung back the knights of Pierre de Remy. And on this occasion, the Count of St. Paul took up the attack with his splendid knights, who had been carefully handpicked because considered that these tactical units were not standardized. So depending on the battle and who participated into it, who, for example, was decided to fight in the front or in the rear, was decided on the spot, right? Sometimes it was the same knights who said, I'll go first, and there was also this sense of, voice that goes first and voice that remains back, from this idea of difference between courage and cowardice, right? And that the authors of the time were very sensible towards. The Count of St. Paul, quick as an eagle, sources say, swooped on the enemy, followed by the Count of Beaumont, Mathieu de Montmorency, and the Duke of Burgundy, also the Burgrave of Milan, and the Count of Sancerre, with all their men. So basically, what you see here is that there is one unit, right, with probably not so many troops, maybe just 30 knights, right, and attached squires, we don't know, that manages to break through, and not only, right, because the units from Champagne, for example, had managed to defeat this Flemish nobleman in their front and to knock him out of action or taking them as prisoners, but they had broke that sector, but they hadn't exploited the gap. Now, what the Count of St. Paul does here is something that appears much more direct, and that inspires these other units to follow in the gap. This is important because on the right wing, the exact breadth of the front was something like 10-40 paces, right? So there is the idea is that it's a long thing, and if you break in one point and other units that are next to you are able to exploit the gap, it's not literally because they follow you behind, but because they manage to open this gap wide. So the thing really starts to go quite seriously for the Flemish at this point. And this battle halted the pursuit. And the Flemish will react, in fact, and that fight back, right? And at this point, the thing gets fundamentally even more chaotic, but is seen even more as a sort of tournament, right? So it's as if this area, this part of the line had, lightened up, and this clash had intensified and got ever more dynamic and heated up, right? And the French at this point managed with Gaucher de Chatillon and his men to break through the ranks of the Flemish knights for good, right? So not only to break actually the enemy formation, but to pass through and attack the Flemish from the rear. Now this maneuver is very interesting because it's often credited as the famous attack from the flank, right? You know, when you study 13th century warfare, there is this set of battles in which this tactic was, employed regularly. And actually, at Bouvines, there is a bit of an exception, because these were not, differently from the other battles, and how it usually happened, these were not concealed parties, right? Hidden somewhere in a valley, in a wooded area or whatever. These were properly attacking an enemy unit that they had broken on the field. So they were out there. They had confronted the enemy face to face. They had break through their lines and now attacking other sections of the line, but from the rear, right? So this is interesting because probably in order to perform the tactic, but probably they had even reformed, right? At this point, 13th century knights are able to, they have such a high level of professionalism that they can perform multiple charges at a time in reorganizing to wage others consequently. So this is something that just hyper-trained cavalries can do. If you don't have feudalism, or at least people who live on horseback on a regular basis, you can't have this. And just think about the exhaustion of the men and the horses. And what Gaucher de Chatillon with his knights did in this regard was also imitated by the Burggraf of Milan and his men. So, as you understand, things get even worse for the Flemish. So not only their line is collapsing on certain parts, but they are even surrounded by the enemies who have pierced through the same division. If there were infantries in the way, well, these were run over, right? Remember when those Flemish knights broke through the light, the French light cavalry that had attacked them. So this is similar, just with the guys on foot that were probably stationed later and behind their knights. And consider that, as we were saying before, the infantry was not meant essentially to halt cavalry alone, right? It was just basically a shield for cavalry between a charge and another. But especially troops, we think that the best infantry in the Anglo-German formation was on the right, the Brabançon pikemen that had also that special formation in circle. The guy, if there was someone in here on foot, they were probably not this huge match in general. And the fighting is ferocious. The Count of St. Paul, while the clash was going on, now was basically killing horses as well as men alike. This is interesting because the Battle of Bouvines is narrated, as we've seen before, by fairly, fully chivalric styled sources that, however, do not remain silent on the unchivalric side of the stories. If like killing horses, for example, it was considered, most unfamous thing, right? Because they costed a freaking lot, and knights between each other. Killing one horse was to kill a lifetime companion was terrible. But this tells you how ferocious the struggle was, and how at this fairly early age, how mindset was growing more secular about these issues, more realistic, right? Even, for example, these sources do not stylicize a duel between Philip Augustus and Otto IV of Brunswick, and if I'm not wrong, the same Guillaume de Breton says that they would have liked to do that, but that their units were so compact that they couldn't reach each other in that sense. So this is very realistic, actually, for those times tactical standards, and this is not just lyrical thing where the single the knight challenges his peer in single combat and the thing. No, there are realistic details about this clash. So the battle here was pretty damn tough. And there is, both sides suffered casualties. There is a fascinating episode, the one of the fall of the Duke of Burgundy, right, as his own horse was killed. So not just the French were killing horses, but also the Flemish, and immediately, and this is a memento on what were feudal tactics, also in a kind of a political and social sense. The Duke was surrounded by a group of his knights, who closed their ranks on him and bit off the enemy attacks so that he could he could be saved, right, and put on a new horse, and so that he could continue fighting, getting in safety. So this is interesting because you see the faithfulness that there is between the Lord, the Duke of Burgundy, that was a high nobleman, and his vassals, right? That as soon as the guy is in danger, this happens also for the sovereigns, as we will see in this very battle, immediately close on him, right, as a bodyguard and protect. Right? This means, by the way, that there was probably a margin left to even the the risk. Right, think about Richard, Lionheart, and that was, had died a few years before, and that was criticized because he exposed too much himself in battle. But this, in this time, the early 13th century, was demanded still to a king. It was a warrior proper, right? It's from 80 years, even more actually, almost 1 century, that since the Battle of Bremoul of August the 20th, 1119, that a French king hadn't personally descended into combat, right? And on that occasion, he had been defeated. So in the French kingdom, this thing had, taken evidently a greater significance because, as we were recalling before, French society was much more hierarchical. So that these men were becoming very powerful for their own establishment, as rulers, and therefore they couldn't be risked so easily, right, on the battlefield. But hey, this was a major clash for the domination of Europe. And in this occasion, of course, everybody would spend themselves, and there was probably a margin in a kind of in ritualized fashion for which, the guy had to prove that he had to charge alone together with all the others, and then if just he fell, here evidently some reserves, or at least troops they're not just involved into combat, but probably yes, actually, but maybe somebody that is, even squires, think, of course they had, even the monarchs had their own squires, would run over them to shield them from the enemy in case that they fell, right? So this was a pretty serious business, and consider even the forces involved. I mean, falling, I don't know, under a horse is, you can't get killed, right? So it's a very risky business in the first place, and these people really, as we'll see, especially from what will happen in the center, were really wanted to kill, right? Even just with daggers, with weapons that were designed actually to pierce in the few openings of the armor here that were designed to literally kill the person, right? Which in chivalric terms wasn't ideally contemplated, but of course already at this time existed. It was quite developed, and was also developing interesting transformation within the same, especially the French cavalry. But what is fascinating here is that how long the fight went on, right? Also consider the exhaustion. This was July the 27th at past noon. Think of what it could be, and in fact, even the Count of St. Paul, after having broken through the ranks of Hainaut and Flemish knights, had to come back at some point to recover his breath together with his men. And in this retreat, so this was always a very risky moment, because that someone is always going to be left behind and one another, right, and captured, probably if he's a knight, or even killed if he's unlike in this regard. And while they were coming back to their own lines, they saw one of their knights that had not been able to keep up and was surrounded by the enemy. So there is this episode of the Count of St. Paul that spends itself as he immediately dashed to the aid of this guy who had remained behind. So this is naturally, an edifying detail, but it's probably realistic in the sense that, still this social certification was at its beginning, and knights considered each other like as peers, and the Lord even as a protector, of course, of his troops. So this action of great courage from a man that had been able also to lead the the spearhead of the formation, at least the one that had managed to create this to break first into the enemy lines, repeats this act of courage, and bent low over his horse's neck, he forced his way through the enemy ranks. This is something that appears often in feudal warfare. You say, how the hell did they do this, right? Of knights that enter into the enemy ranks and come out of them after having killed someone or after having kidnapped someone. This is very interesting, and naturally on horseback the mobility is different than on foot, but in this regard you also understand you have to smash through, right? There are people on the way, you're going to kill people on the way, right? So this is definitely fascinating, and he, especially because he managed to bring his men back, right? And after a short rest also, the same Count of St. Paul came back to fight together with his company. So this is a huge, this is the peak of feudal prowessness, right? This capacity of, charging back and forth. And think about how this thing was theoretically to be all calibrated, in the sense you can't do this if you're not trained in a way to spare your sources. Like if you exhaust yourself because you overstrain yourself in this situation, you can't fight even later, right? So this thing was all timed in a way. Also, there was all a physicality involved that had to deal with even the unforeseen and the risk. So this was, there's the structure here, if you want, the structure of feudalism and all its technique and professionalism and experience, but at the same time still this act of audacity and boldness and individual prowess that are the memory of the ancient warrior that emerged still as that give the extra touch of authority, of charisma, and admiration to the Lord, to the Count of St. Paul, right? The idea here is that the French gradually managed to launch this devastating attack on the Count of Flanders' more loosely packed formation, right? And this speaks for what we were saying before. Probably this line was probably more compact in the single units, even if maybe more spread out than the one of the enemy. So it was punching something softer, right? More diluted, with this more concentrated parties, right? And this was feasible naturally at a cost of a greater risk of the enemy maybe entering the gaps between the formation, and this reveals in itself what the French cavalry in this regard over the Flemish one was achieving, probably in a structural sense, right? When people judge this battle, they often say, they mostly make it a French versus German thing, whereas there were actually a few German cavalrymen. They were mostly Flemish in this regard, that were the ones that did the most in this sense. The Germans and the English, as we will see on the center and on the right, of the Ghibelline, of the imperial formation, kind of did well after all. And here it's mostly like the French knights against the Flemish knights, and I would say, even if you look at the two, the difference in the two political and social systems, that of course the French had somewhat a systemic advantage of some sort that of course could be diluted into many other factors interplaying here, but that probably posed French cavalry at if anything, but still at the slightest higher level than the other knights in terms of collective training. Right, this is what makes the difference. It's not that a Flemish knight was not as courageous, as skilled individually, right, as a French knight, but altogether maybe less, right, because there were less numbers. There was a less feudal system, we could say, than in France, in Flanders, right? So these are always judgments that must be taken with a grain of salt, but they're still valid probably in a historical perspective. And the idea, though, is that we get from this is that the Flemish and Hainaut knights didn't break easily, right? Honor kept them on the battlefield. They kept resisting, like they were taking it like crazy, right? It was evident things were going increasingly worse for them, but they held their line for a long time, right? And the French were struggling to make them finally collapse, right? Naturally, someone was beginning to flee individually. Maybe the sources, I don't know if they talk about this, but sometimes regularly before these battles, there was always some knight that was advancing and then threw the lance away, the shield away, and ran away from the battlefield, because for whichever reason, that wasn't even maybe because of cowardice, but that was naturally judged as such. But in a political perspective, is maybe the guy didn't agree with that, how that policy, that battle, why he had been brought in there, and he had made his, he had spotted the situation, thought it was better to leave, right? Things like this. And this battle, as we were saying before, went on for about 3 hours, right? And at this point, Hugues and Jean de Mareuil cut their way through to the wounded Count of Flanders, right? The horse of whom had been killed, by the way. And Ferdinand had to give himself up, and this was the death blow to his formation. So the Count of Flanders had spent himself as well, and had showed the good example. Leadership here is really meaningful. It has a lot to do with, whether your commander is still on horseback and still fighting, still, engaging the enemy, because there is all this emulative behavior that is, still, I can't be less of my lord, right? And as long as he's there, he will. So his horse had been killed, he's been wounded, and he's able to, he's obliged to give up at some point, and he's taken prisoner. So this is really that blow to the Anglo-German left. And this is a very serious issue, because as we have seen probably in here, there was the majority of the cavalry forces, at least. And so we leave temporarily the southern front, the southern division, to see what was happening in the center, because at this point, or right around there, we don't really know, we have seen that Philip Augustus was, arrayed with his fleur de lis. Now, and bodyguard and all, the royal convoi. This is how it was called. And the French communal infantry, right, the commune, right, commoners, had arrived on the battlefield, and they had made this, walk for 2.5 miles. Some of them had already passed the bridge, so they arrived later in this sense, and marching under the banner of Saint-Denis, as we were saying before, and the renowned Oriflamme, and they passed through probably the formation of Philip Augustus, and that was evident because he had risen, actually the standard with the fleur de lis on. He's also represented usually with the fleur de lis on his coat of arms on the battlefield, and the surcoat, and so on. So it's the gathering point, considering that the battle line, as we've seen, was 2 miles, right? So banners here are fundamental. Even the statute of the Templars, say it pretty explicitly, right? That's the meeting ground, the meeting point, right? And it's an easy way of, it's a gathering point in case of also, of things go worse, where you can retreat to and so on. If that falls, things are pretty damn serious. These were men from the cities of Corbie, Amiens, Beauvais, Compiègne, and Arras, who deployed in front of the king's knights. And this is very interesting because obviously the function of the infantry here is kind of unusual and aimed evidently at making use of cavalry as a reserve, right? And therefore having this kind of stopping role against the imperial cavalry that is in front of them, while the Otto's infantry is behind the cavalry in a function of support. In fact, what happens here, we don't really understand clearly how, the timing went, but as soon, at least, as the French commoners had taken up their position in front of the king, Otto, the emperor, together with the Allied center, made their attack. And as a predictable result, these infantry levies were thrown back, right? And Otto's knights broke through towards the French king, right? This is interesting because, as we've seen, for example, on the French right flank, the light cavalry, the unarmored cavalry, charged into the, heavily armored knights. Here, the light infantry, light in the sense of, not armored as knights, is placed in the front to meet the charge of the imperial heavy cavalry. The function seems to be exactly the same, to actually soften up the enemy ranks by making them charge through this formation that evidently was not a match, because as we were recalling before, cavalry at this time breaks into infantry and defeats it, but still grows disorderly, and there is some loss and some confusion, some disorder. And right behind the cavalry, the infantry, there is the cavalry. Also, don't consider in this sense that, always consider this, that exactly at this point, the noblemen considered the commoners are as garbage, right? Evidently here, Philip had given them the honor to bring the Oriflamme, to have this privileged role, actually, to be in front of the king, but still, for a fate that you as understand here is readily served, like they were broken. And this sense of reserve and of gradual effort is emphasized also by the fact that when the infantry was broken in the center, the French cavalry charged the emperor's knights in turn. So you see what obviously slow down the emperor's knights that evidently are that's pretty evident. You see, it would have been more chivalric to meet them on face to face, like French cavalry in the front, just like the German one. But they preferred not to do it. There is too much at stake at that point, and it's kind of intelligent to have put the infantry in the front. And even more, the king is actually left a little behind. That is, they don't make it charge together with the rest of the troops. This is definitely very important, and it has nothing to do with cowardice or, an excess of prudence. On the contrary, right? This is exactly the way you want to behave in that condition, because if Philip had, fallen, let's say, in the first impact, the battle entirely was lost for such a, an unavoidable thing, right? And so this is actually interesting and important. Evidently, for the Allied army, the thing was a bit different in the sense that, of course, Otto was Holy Roman Emperor, but he didn't have as much power as Philip in his own regard. And also, the army was less, as we've seen, less united, even just in spirit, right? And therefore, probably the German knights, in this sense, say, okay, if we lose this, we will probably, even at home in Germany, the whole cause will be discredited. The German nobility, as we've seen, was already, unhappy of Otto, and a defeat might have brought to rebellion in the whole kingdom. So they said, you know what, we spend ourselves altogether, because if we fail, we're done for, right? And and this is probably the reasoning, together perhaps with a bit more of German fanaticism, because let's be honest, even the French sources stress the fact of the Furor Teutonicus. There was an actual thing, like what the Germans, especially, this is especially true in the 13th century, that the Germans, it's very interesting. I made, as you know, actually a master thesis on a German battle, and of the 13th century, and there was the recognition from the same Germans that actually the French knights were better than them in terms of cavalrymen, in terms of equestrian capabilities proper, but definitely in Germany it was this more individualistic, kind of more individualistic warlike mentality for which that is recorded everywhere, wherever they fought against the French, against the Italians, that observed this kind of bold attacks in which the Germans basically put everything, right? If it wasn't properly technique, it was this dash and impetus and blind courage and fanaticism in this regard. And they often succeeded because of this, but that is also an admission that if you have to recur to do that, it's almost suicidal. It's because you don't have many other means to do otherwise, right? So this means in general that this attack in the center sounds very German according to these stereotypical standards, right? And the French in here have a greater tactical mind, if you want, and we've seen it also on the right flank against the Flemish. So this is interesting, in fact, because Otto's knights engage Philip's knights, and the German infantry follows them for a short distance. So this is interesting because it shows cooperation between cavalry and infantry, right? And this probably also means that there were more infantry than cavalry, especially considering that there's this climatic moment in which Philip Augustus, that had evidently joined combat by this point, because he was still required, even with all the responsibility that he had, that if he died, that the whole kingdom was lost, and that would have been an epical thing, was thrown from his horse, right, by infantrymen, right, who used pikes and other actually pole arms that had special hooks with which they used actually to pull the riders off their horses, right? And there is this scene in which Philip Augustus is basically harpooned literally by this imperial infantry that pulls him from one side, and all of his knights basically throw themselves on him and pull him from the other side. So it's kind of comical at the same time. This tells you really about the physical strains of this and how physical this thing really was, especially if you wanted to kill a knight. There was no other way but to literally grab him and try to mobilize him in some way. So naturally, in here, actually, he even risked life because they wanted actually to kill him in the battle proper with certain stocks. He was saved by his men really narrowly, and Gal de Montigny also called for help at once, signaled to other knights with a royal standard that they had to come back there to help. And at this point, Pierre Tristan dismounted and offered the king his own horse, right? It was a very chivalrous thing to do. And Philip quickly jumped on horseback on the saddle, and he was safe thanks to his followers, to his stout armor, and also to his physical fitness, because he was in his I don't remember, he was 49 or 50 at this point, but at that time, kings had to fight. There were knights like all the others in this regard. There were people who went to tournament even when they were 80, right? And the physical strains were, considered they always kept fit, trained, so they literally fought as up to the point that they couldn't move, right, because of age, right? And he was still evidently kind of a athletical person. and both sides in the center suffered heavy losses. We know of Etienne de Longchamp, that was killed in the French Royal Division, as he was wounded through the eye slit in his helmet. This is atrocious, right? So he was probably, wounded at his eye or brain behind it. And this is, as you know, the moment in medieval warfare in which basically the front, the face cover develops so that the helmet will enclose itself. First it began with a plate in front of the forehead and the eyes, then it enclosed with the great helm style, of a helmet. And the eye slits were the only, they were very narrow, right? Because exactly when knights clashed against each other, they aimed usually at their faces. So the lances and the splints, etc., could enter even. They were horrendous wounds. And the idea is that these slits were also reinforced gradually with further plaques, etc., just to give the just like with the holes for breathing, the minimal opening to counter these blows at the face that were, as you understand, the riskiest thing ever. But in this battle, we find even knights were killed through with daggers stuck in the eye slit, right? So that's as brutal as it can get. And in the center, the fight was very, very bloody. In general, there was this combination between cavalry and infantry that probably didn't even help to maintain the order. However, the French managed to counterattack at some point and to essentially break the imperial center, right? The infantrymen were actually repelled, right? So here the French cavalry managed to get rid of this footman, which remarks once again the superiority of feudal cavalry over the infantries. And as a consequence, the whole imperial division had to fall back, right? So Otto retreated at this point, and this is heavy, right? Even if, as we have seen, there were Englishmen, Flemish, etc. Still the fact that that was the Holy Roman Emperor. Doesn't matter if excommunicated, whatever his business with the papacy was, but if the center is broken, we're freaking and here we can't get the right timing with the collapse of the Flemish, with the left wing south, but it probably happened in parallel in some way, and even here there was presumably a long engagement, or actually we don't know, but it seems like it was also a hard fought combat. And this is interesting because it probably also reflects the few amount of German knights that were present in Otto's division. Here he had his bodyguard, who were actually pretty good knights that protected him, as we'll see now. And but probably here the majority of the troops was composed by infantry, and this doesn't speak quite well actually for the whole army in general, even if we have seen that probably infantry remained behind in great numbers from the Anglo-German side, but still the fact that the emperor would come to battle with just a few hundreds of his own troops proper, and just to be joined by this masses of infantrymen to fight against the French king, it doesn't sound quite presentable, right, in feudal terms, given that theoretically the French king should be a vassal of the Holy Roman Emperor. And in this context, Otto risked to be captured or even killed. Pierre Mauvesin reached his bridle, right, but he could not get Otto out of the close formation, which hedged him, right, so the imperial bodyguards were doing a good job. There was another knight, Gérard La Trouille, who tried to kill the emperor with a dagger, but the blade glanced off his coat of mail and struck Otto's horse in the eye. So basically, the horse kind of, started springing around, bolted, and fell dead a little way off. So Otto was naturally thrown off the horse, and he mounted on another one that he was brought to him by his faithful knights. And there were other pretty upsetting moments in this situation. Just think of what it means, by the way. Also, aside from the violence and the physical strains, but just about the psychological situation. I mean, you're losing. The thing is crumbling in front of his eyes. You're terrorized. There are these people who are coming exactly at you, right? And these guys weren't faking their identities. Like, you could recognize the emperor on the field, and this was a matter of pride and honor to be recognized with your own emblems. Was very, very important. And there was another knight Guillaume de Bar, who rushed up behind the emperor, caught up with him, and seized him, right? But he couldn't overthrow Otto down the horse, and therefore he was soon attacked by the emperor's bodyguard. So Guillaume, that had attacked the emperor on horseback, of course, was thrown from his own horse, right, and fought bravely on foot, right, while the German knights were pressing on him. And before he was about to collapse, Thomas de Saint-Valery, that theoretically had to be on the French left, actually is present here, rushed to his help with his following of 50 knights, and saved him. Right. This is interesting because this could tell us, I don't know, Thomas de Saint-Valery was close. I mean, we get actually the impression that the center divisions and the respectively the French left and the let's say the English right were closer than the southern divisions. Right. It sounds like that they were probably less and closer to them. It was probably not a coincidence. So this fact is Thomas de Saint-Valery came to help in the from the left to the center of the array. It's quite fascinating because it also gives you the sense of how it's not that everybody was fighting at the same time, right? These clashes went back and forth, and therefore maybe Thomas was there. Maybe he hadn't even engaged yet. We don't know. Or maybe he was just resting from between a charge and another. So this guy, right? By the way, he wasn't come. This was a single knight, as far as I understand, and so he went there to help him with other 50 knights, right? So this is very, very interesting, and it also tells us how much pressure, actually, the imperial bodyguard was taking at that point. During all this, Philip Augustus remained back a little bit with these knights that guarded him, Gauthier de Nemours, Barthélemy de Roy, and Guillaume de Garlande, who thought it was better to protect him and to keep the king away from the front line. So after having suffered such accidents, Otto decided to get away from the battlefield, and he was escorted out of the camp by 4 German lords that stayed next to him in the bodyguard. They were Bernhard von Ostmark, Otto von Tecklenburg, Konrad von Dortmund, and Gerhard von Randerrath. And his followers, however, remained actually fighting bravely, right, and sacrificing themselves in the process. They were taken prisoner, right, all of them. This shows definitely the great fealty of feudal culture, for which your emperor is retreating from the field. Okay, we remain here, we get taken prisoner, we don't care as long as he can flee safely from the field. This is actually, as we said also in other videos, that during retreats there is always someone who behaves like that. in a way or another. But this is interesting because it's not accidental. I mean, they decided it, right, consciously to do it in order to make the emperor flee, right? Also, there's a detail that we didn't say during the deployment, but it's, we have seen Philip Augustus had the banner with the fleur de lis, whereas Otto the Fourth had at the top of the hill where he was deployed put a wagon with the banner of the imperial eagle surmounting a black dragon, right? And the French knights at this point that were storming the hilltop, this last German knights resisting, captured the wagon and brought it to Philip Augustus. So this is the imperial banner in the hands of the French king, right? This is a huge thing. We didn't stress it at the beginning because we wanted to skip a bit thing, but consider the important here. It's the King of France that defeats the Holy Roman Emperor in open field. Where you find this, right? It's wild, even if the international situation is wild. But exactly, that's what it reflects itself on the field as well. What is fascinating of the wagon with the eagle and the dragon is actually the dragon, because of course, I mean, the Roman imperial eagle was all over the place. The Germans thought of themselves now like the Romans, right? I mean, they were Germans, but they took Rome. That was the pride, and there is in these sources all the ideology that was proper of Charlemagne that we discussed a few days ago, by the way, according to which the Franks thought they had surpassed the Romans and taken the Christian Empire by themselves. So now the French historiographers after Bouvines were chanting the fact that the Franks, right, the heirs of Charlemagne, as now the Western Franks, the French consider themselves, were defeating the Romans. Right, that is what is said. The Germans were thinking of themselves now, and taking therefore now with what France will actually become in the 13th century. That is actually the true empire, we can say. Right, during the 13th century, France basically takes over an enormous amount of land: southern France, southern Italy, parts of Greece. I mean, there is this enormous thing. The Angevins, I mean, properly the Capetian branch of the Anjou that eventually, will sit on the thrones of Poland, of Hungary. I mean, it will be a huge thing, right? And while the Holy Roman Empire after Frederick II, but already during him, will disgregate. So you will actually have, at the end of the 13th century, France that acts actually like the universal power in Europe, from a secular point of view, even from a theological, I mean, from a spiritual point of view, because at some point says, even the French king assumes even Caesar-papistic prerogatives, like the idea that, they could even surpass the papacy in the French church, right, as kings. So this is a very important ideological thing, and in the sources, the black dragon on Otto's banner here represents actually a symbol of paganism. And whether this is a French invention or not, actually, I mean, animals like this figured prominently in heraldry out there. But definitely there were certain specific symbols here that could have to do partly with, what Germany was representing at that point. I mean, Otto of Brunswick was anti-Swabian, and therefore is being considered even historically, for example, from the nationalistic German historiography in the 19th century, as the Welfen that had, from Saxony, really represented the German national alternative to the Swabian universalism. That is to say, I mean, anachronistically and actually wrongly from a historical point of view, as if the Swabians just wanted to pursue the chimera of the Mediterranean dream, and instead the Welfen were pursuing the German thing in Saxony, creating the Hansa, expanding against the Slavs in the east. So obviously, if the Welfen had become emperors, like in this case, they would have pursued the same policy. In fact, Otto was about to reunite Sicily, right? And if he had win at Bouvines, he would have done it. So he would have done exactly the same thing. So the nationalistic historiography is garbage as usual. But the point here is that there was possibly in parallel to this an actual kind of reminiscence. I can't say reminiscence of paganism, but I could say, I don't know, the last time in Western warfare where the Draco standards from the steppes from the migration era appear is actually in 13th century Germany. That is to say that is a world that is barely civilized at this point. I mean, even feudalism had been brought from Western Frankish model had been brought to Germany only from the second half of the 12th century. Especially the North Saxony is kind of poorer areas compared to the rich south of Swabia and Austria. Were kind of really the rougher and the tougher, let's say, I would say wild, or even Germans in that regard, even in terms of sense of spirit of I don't know how to explain it properly, but the idea of the dragon here that couples the eagle is just saying, like, here we are not the Swabians anymore, we are something different, we are acting from a different perspective. I don't know, it may be a historiographical invention or whatever, but it's still fascinating that even if you look at Otto's policy, I'm not an expert on him actually, but he objectively acted in a pretty cunning way. I mean, the Swabians, after all, were fairly honest with the papacy. I mean, they were enemies with them at in the moment, which actually the same papacy took the initiative against him, but formally they were still cooperating in the sense of the two universal powers. Here, the 13th century in many ways is the affirmation of universalism, but also it's going past it. And Germany was in deep crisis in many ways from a political, institutional point of view, and Otto behaved like someone who wanted to seize everything as quickly as possible, even perjuring against the promise he made with the papacy not to reunite North and South. So here the whole stereotype is that he was kind of a son of a bitch, because by the way, he had killed Philip of Sway. I mean, he had made pretty serious, pretty nasty things in general, and the picture doesn't quite shine. But of course, he must be understood in his context, an historical figure. But say stereotypically, we get this trace, even as if the dragon here was a pagan symbol, right? And who knows? Pagan symbols remained, broadly speaking, and this touch here may be something in this sense. We will see later even how the French stereotype a little bit in this source is the Christianity and the not so perfect Christianity of the the enemy, actually, the Christianity of the French and this Holy Roman Emperor that gets defeated by divine will, but also by chivalry, because in the historiography here, God decides the thing, but without chivalry, this is the sense of the French sources, without the system that France created, this victory could have not happened. So there is a lot of pride indeed in this picture, and the situation here, as you understand, for the Anglo-Germans is getting pretty damn bad, right? And the resistance had collapsed in the center. The left wing had been shattered, right? But on the right wing, there were these pretty good troops still under Renaud de Dampmartin, together with the Count of Salisbury and with the Brabançon pikemen, etc. And these kind of special tactics, and especially Renaud enacted, thanks to especially these footmen that, as we have seen, weren't very appreciated by the knightly elite, but still were at this point very, very useful. And as we were saying at the beginning, the Brabançon pikemen were deployed in a circle formation, and Dampmartin would simply go back and forth this formation as a base, right, to sortie against the French cavalry from the other side. And this is a clever move because naturally it increases the safety of the cavalry. Naturally, this is a detail we can't see. Normally cavalry did something like that with other infantry, right? But this is kind of more scenographic, and we don't know. We know, of course, of circle formations, of skill turns, things like these. And it might have been even possibly a semicircular formation that is not necessarily an entire circle, but just half circle towards the enemy. And it seemingly wasn't very deep. I don't know whether a source says explicitly that it was just 2 ranks deep, but anyhow, still pikemen that have an auxiliary role in this sense, even in a defensive formation. And the situation in the right wing is not completely clear, because there is, I think, a source that says clearly that Renaud de Dampmartin and the Count of Salisbury, with these mercenaries, attacked somewhat very late, right? Verbruggen thinks even at the moment in which actually the battle in the center was turning to the French advantage. We don't know why, right? We don't know how the coordination worked. What were the moral strengths involved. We don't know. Also about Hugues de Bove, the knight that had actually pressed Otto to give battle that day, was supposed to be fighting in the Allied right wing, is never mentioned being involved in the battle. This could also explain the episode of Thomas de Saint-Valery that intervenes in favor of that knight that had attacked Otto. So it's as if they had, in the French left wing, that they weren't doing much either. So that they were just, I don't know, looking at each other, skirmishing. We don't know, really. And we just know, however, that Hugues de Bove, as soon as he and the Duke of Brabant and the Duke of Limburg understood that the left wing was beaten, so and that the center under Otto was also going to collapse. So it seems here we get the progression that the battle had really began south, and then starting gradually towards the north. They took to their heels, right? And William de Breton says in groups, in hundreds, in 50s, right? And Verbruggen thinks this is an exaggeration, but actually I think it's possible in the sense that, see the battle is lost, you start retreating with all the parties you have. All the various units, knights and infantrymen, right? Considering we have actually news of infantry in the right wing, so these numbers may not be so low, and actually that the fact that they were living all together, all in pack, the fact that they were in groups, in hundreds, in 50s, literally, could actually be realistic. That is to say, it's not a rout that happens maybe suddenly, but in a disorderly way. This sounds as if there was a method in it. So the Flemish foot soldiers, who had only just arrived and passed equally without mentioning battle, saw that all was lost as well. So we have information that not all the infantry was here deployed exactly. The men of Bruges, who were the closest, also turned at once and gave the signal for a general retreat on the left wing and in the Allied center. So this is interesting because there is even probably these Flemish contingents were numerous enough to have weight for in the command in some way. So for the men of a city to give a general signal to two entire divisions, including the imperial one, to retreat is it's apparently proof of their importance, and the fact that someone had realized that the whole thing had been lost in general, and the fact that probably they were not going to save them, right? So they were signaling the fact that they were getting away. So just to say, look, we are going away. So probably these troops were really important even in number, and this increases further the idea that probably the Allied army wasn't so numerous necessarily or superior in numbers compared to the French one. We can say they were less, but these troops were coming to the battlefield just now. Whereas as we have seen, the French communes had been wiped out by the first imperial charge, and now the imperial center was shattered. Otto had abandoned the field. So there is a progression related. Substantial time had passed here. What happens on the right wing, however, that is worth of mention is the resistance of actually, first of all, the combat that ensued, because Renaud de Dampmartin and the Count of Salisbury were involved into heavy fighting, right, with the knights of the French left wing, including the Count of Dreux, Thomas de Saint-Valery, also the Bishop of Beauvais, the Count of Ponthieu, and the men of Ponthieu and Vimont. And this fight seems to have been evenly matched, because the Bishop of Beauvais saw that the men of his brother, the Count of Dreux, by the way, and they were technically in the same unit, so I don't know here whether he probably was not partaking to the combat proper, were being weakened under the pressure of the Earl of Salisbury men, right? And that were good troops, as we've seen. These were mercenaries from England, and since the bishop was a cleric, he was not permitted to shed blood, right? And this is Bouvines, this battle for which the sources say explicitly that since the guy could not shed blood, he rushed up to the earl with a bludgeon and hit him with such a tremendous blow in the helmet that he fell and was taken prisoner. So from here, everybody says, you see, bishops in the Middle Ages used maces because, other blunt trauma weapons, not cutting weapons, because they couldn't shed blood. So from now on, every single bishop in the Middle Ages must use a mace, because that's everywhere. Actually, this is one of the few, very few actually, information about this, and we actually dispose of sources that tell us that bishops fought, of course, with any kind of weapon they had, right, just like the other knights. But ideally, this is an idea. These are sources talking in ideal terms, and this is a bit of revenge taken on the English, in the sense that the Count of Salisbury now was recognized his prowess, but he was basically traumatized and taken out, knocked out from combat for this major heavy blow by the Bishop of Beauvais, that, by the way, was one of the most important dioceses in France, and that had its own importance, symbolism in this regard. So that is to say, this is the church that punishes the bold secular knight that sells his services. Why, look what bishops can do to these people, our French bishops. Like, this is Bouvines sets, if anything, for its consequences, kind of proto-national feeling at an institutional level. Like, objectively, the English were kicked out of France in this after this battle. There was an Anglicization of the Angevin political, culture, right, at that point, especially with the Magna Carta, etc. Also because all the barons, the English barons, the so-called English barons, actually were Frenchmen that liked much more their French possessions than England, right? And after the battle, they were all lost. So here, this battle marks an actual separation between the two things, if anything, also from a geographical, linguistical point of view. That will naturally develop further as French culture was dramatically important in England, but the same Magna Carta was written in French, but it was one of the last documents to be written in French there. So this is also very significant. And so as we've seen, the Count of Salisbury was taken prisoner. So after he was taken out of combat, Renaud de Dampmartin was basically resisting alone, while the rest of the Anglo-German army had been defeated, basically. And he was keeping to strike because basically the French knights now couldn't come close with their short weapons to the long pikes of the Brabançons. So their horses were too vulnerable. At this point, there was gambeson, padded clothing for horses, but in general, you don't go with pikes against, with it against pikes. And these men were determined there. They were ballers, and they knew they would have not, nobody would have paid a ransom to them. That is, they were condemned to die, and therefore they resisted to the last. and with Renaud at this point had remained just 6 knights apparently fighting, and he kept making these sorties. His horse was wounded at one point by Pierre de la Tournelle, whose own charger had been killed, right, and was now fighting on foot. So interesting realization of knights, of course, being able to fight perfectly on foot. One of Renaud's knights in these circumstances tried to push his lord's horse by the bridle to push him, to take him away in safety, but he was taken down by 2 brothers, Jean and Caisse de Coudon, and the Count's horse soon fell as well, and Damartin was taken down, and he laid with his right shoulder under his horse's neck. So just think about even the physical strains and damages and all these traumas in general, psychophysical traumas, right? And Hugues and Gauthier de Fontaine now hastened up with Jean de Rouvray, and they began to quarrel about to whom Damartin belonged as a prisoner, right? And at this point, Jean de Nesle, with his knights that had not taken part to the battle, came and demanded actually this glory of taking the Count of Damartin, and they kept arguing about this up to when the Bishop Guérin, that now after his right wing was victorious, was free of responsibility, came on the left division and had Renaud de Damartin surrendering to him, right? And there was even a last counter-strike by Arnulf of Oudenarde, who came to help Renaud de Damartin, trying to free him with force, but he and his men could not succeed and were actually taken prisoner themselves in turn, right? And Renaud de Damartin was led to Philip Augustus himself. The Brabançon troops, the foot soldiers, fought basically to the last instead. They suffered probably heavy losses at this point, because even before being completely wiped out, because basically the whole French forces converged on them, right? They were probably surrounded first by infantry and probably targeted also by the crossbowmen, and eventually they were ridden down by Thomas de Saint-Valery with his knights, 50 knights, and foot soldiers as well, and therefore the formation broke, right? So this has nothing to do with the type of tactics that we're employing. This has to do with the fact, you're surrounded, you're over. I mean, just think about the idea. You're gonna die, because these valorous commoners commoners' lives were too worthless for a ransom. So they knew they would die, and therefore you can't imagine what kind of they were slaughtered to the last. Right, they were slaughtered to the last, and this episode is fascinating because it still shows the determination of infantries from this area that in the next century would actually be able to defeat the French cavalry alone in the fields of Courtrai, for example. So basically, the French won in this way, and this ended the Battle of Bouvines, and the actually Philip Augustus didn't want the pursuit to protract for too much, for more than a mile, right? First of all, night was falling, so the battle had lasted actually a lot of hours, and especially he was afraid that during the chase some important prisoners might manage to escape, because too many people spread out. Maybe there is some counterattack. We don't know. There's always this danger, of course, that the enemy can regroup and launch an attack with darkness. This was not the case. Yet he ordered the trumpeters to recall the divisions, that in part had spread out. You can imagine even, I don't know about the wagons, I don't think we know, but just think about all the spoils of war, even the dead, and the captured. And in terms of the Anglo-German losses, we know that no less than 131 knights had fallen in French hands, including 5 counts and 25 constables, right, knights banneret. And we don't know how many dead happened. The idea is that these battles were not particularly bloody for the knights, but as a consequence, when such massacres happened, we get usually the information of it, but we don't know how many infantrymen were killed, because actually nobody cared about them. But we have an inscription at the Church of Saint Nicolas at Arras that tells that 300 knights were captured or killed from the Anglo-Germans that day, which means, if we want to parallel to sources that of this, if 131 knights had been taken into French hands and 3 knights were captured or killed, well, the dead could be 169, so the remainder. And yes, I mean, very simply, this is it. And if you read the sources of this battle, it's even more fascinating. Of course, there is much more to deepen. But let's say that the essentials, more or less, of the tactical development of this battle are here, right? There would be a lot actually to talk about, looking at all the various sources and trying to play with them to realize even about the synchrony of this all. For example, when did actually the old combat happen, right? We can't even understand it. As we've seen, it started south and went north, but more than this we have really no clue. And also there are sources that say they contradict each other. I mean, that guy was taken down by infantrymen instead by knights. There are actually these dozens of examples that you can get from the sources, and they are very chivalric in nature, so they obviously reflect that kind of feudal warfare we were talking about before, and they are showing this what naturally caught more the attention of the listeners, right? If not the readers even, but given that these sources were fundamentally destined to a nightly audience in a way, so that's what people really cared the most about. As we were saying before, this battle, however, shows already this kind of advancement of feudal tactics, right? I'm making this point, as we were saying before, because of the 13th century as basically the perfection of feudal tactics. Other battles were usually, about troops deployed in depth. This is, interestingly, a battle actually deployed in line, which is much more kind of face-to-face conceptually, and I don't think there is any other way to switch the sources so that you can reconstruct a battle in which the thing was actually in a, the array was actually in depth, right? I would have to look at the sources honestly, because every time I make a video, when I haven't studied the sources, that could take weeks if not months. When you really want to do it properly, that Battle of the Master Thesis took me 1 year, right? And this is the 13th century, so you can imagine the amount of sources sometimes. This is probably not so complicated, but it requires, you must know vernacular. I mean, it's very complex. After all, you have to value all the possible, literary influences, the interrelations between the sources. It's a very complicated thing. That's why I can't but make now a video of just how many hours is this, 2, 3, whatever. That appears to be excruciatingly long, but at the same time, to me, it's the minimum to say, okay, this is the essential. We can say then this is just like an introduction to the actual historical work, because getting to that point is a very serious thing, and there is a lot to say. So naturally, the knightly tactics seem to be dominating, in appearance, but definitely this is true mostly on the southern side, on the French right and the Allied left, right, where knights are basically here depicted in a perfectly tournament scenario, right? So this is the typical knightly clash that every knight would have liked to get in, like hundreds of knights fighting each other back and forth and making these acts of bravery, and it's purely against cavalry, apparently. Then if there was infantry there too, which is likely, we don't know, but it's at least the sources told us chiefly about cavalry, and that's the point. In the and there is definitely in this sector this interesting presence of the probably some of the most sophisticated tactics employable by cavalry. Here, the only thing that lacks is a possible feint retreat, that a feint flight that is actually not present. There are knights, this lighter cavalrymen that throw themselves against the enemy lines to be butchered down, to disrupt the enemy formation in the process, to soften up their ranks. And then these we get this information about the two ranks in this apparently poorly explained thing of how the Bishop of Senlis had deployed all the various units on the front, that we don't really understand. I think they were, honestly, at least in the way I've read this studies, it mostly sounded like a good balance, possibly a continuous line, but still meant probably in these thickly packed units, right, separated from each other by some space, but I don't think in the single line, in the sense that these were actually singled knights against other singled knights in the front. We have seen that from the same sources. The units are, the sources are, the information is clear. These guys attacked with other knights behind them, at least. So I don't buy the thing of the continuous line with a single rank, right, without without, for example, this split of the more courageous and less courageous. Like, what does it exactly mean? Is it really two ranks? Is it really something, where's the infantry here? Why should I have not used it, and why these feudal contingents had it? And yeah, it's a normal segmentation. Normally the bravest were put in the front, right, unless you wanted to spend the more cowardly ones. This light infantry had done the job, but they were not the less courageous knights. So there are lots of questions, but what really emerges from here is a use of gradual effort that is definitely a logical military principle, and also the capacity of these units to organize themselves, having broken into the enemy lines, and to finish off the enemy formation with a charge on the flank. As far as I remember, I always found mentioned this fact of the attack from the flank as a sort of, I would say, as if Bouvines was characteristics such as other battles like Lincoln Fair, Muret, Tagliacozzo, Markfeld, etc., were actually which actually the units that attacked from the flank was concealed. Here we don't really have this. There is not really a concealed unit. We have a unit that is fighting in front of everybody, it breaks through the enemy ranks, probably regroups and attacks the rest of the enemies on the flank, right? Which, it's probably what happened every time you broke a formation of some sort. Maybe this was done in a more orderly way. Also, we don't understand how much Guérin, Bishop of Senlis, was responsible for this. It was mostly the Count of Saint-Paul, Gautier of the Châtillon, who, as we have seen, was a very brave fighter and performed like what a professional knight was theoretically able to do in every situation. So it's it's very interesting to see this kind of group behavior, all the various units actually exploiting each other's gaps or widening them in a way. But and we can imagine the competition here, but it doesn't seem something extremely new after all, right? So this mention of attack from the flank should be watched a little bit better, because it could be maybe more diluted than what had happened in other battles, where you actually had a concealed party that at the moment, at the most important moment, attacked an entire division from the rear and make it break. This is not the case. As we have seen, that the fight actually went on for a long time. I don't know whether the attack from the flank eventually caused the retreat of the Wall division, but I don't think so. I think he just attacked like another detachment and another unit and make it fell, but the fighting went on along the division, the Flemish division. So this thing overall is interesting, as it's interesting actually the Flemish resistance, the fact that these guys didn't break as soon as the thing happened. So it's very, very 13th century standard ideal chivalric combat, possibly from a collective point of view in terms of divisional maneuvers and concealed parties. It's not such an enormous difference from how knights fought at the time in general. The fight in the center is interesting between Philip Augustus and Otto of Brunswick, as there is this sacrificable role of the infantry as the one of light cavalry, as we've seen on the right flank, with the German cavalry charging into the infantry and breaking it, and being attacked in turn by the French Royal cavalry. And this fight that involves infantry and cavalry alike, the fact that Philip Augustus is brought down by enemy infantry, which means that had the guts to attack cavalry at the same time in an aggressive way, probably in concert with their own cavalry, but still in a way that could put into trouble a king and bringing his knights to take him back from these infantrymen. So wherever they came from, these guys were wild, and they should be even perhaps more credited to maybe even than the Brabançons that were surrounded at some point. So that is fascinating. These are poons, these pole arms that were able even to literally hook the enemy armor and to and take the knights down, and even trying to capture them while on the ground. We have seen Otto of Brunswick bodyguard behaved well, like they defended effectively the emperor, and also they remained on the field to allow his retreat. So very good behavior actually, and they should also be credited for what concerns instead the northern combat. We understand less what actually happened. Like there's less attention towards this. And it's kind of strange, because after all, these troops might have, if they had engaged each other before, they might have, the winner might have taken out the enemy center that was, anyway with their respective sovereigns. So it's strange why they didn't attack actually, and even the time sequence that's here, it's suspicious in a way. I don't know. I mean, I of course I'm no one to presume to tell how these guys how to fight, but it's there's something we can see maybe, or actually the engagement started, right? We've seen Thomas de Saint-Valery that eventually even participates to the battle in the center. This to go saves one single knight. I mean, 50 knights of saving one that had attacked Otto of Brunswick, which makes us suggest that he kind of, he was pretty close, at least in sight, right? And the situation here, it's blurry. We can't really tell what happened. I would say naturally the circles of the Brabançon infantry is quite fascinating. Also, the clash between the Count of Dreux and the Earl of Salisbury was, pretty standard, I would say, and the rest is, that this resistance of the Brabançons, it's remarkable as well, right? And we don't know. I don't know. I read sources to tell that they gave up. They were killed to the end, inflicting losses to the enemy. And in forces, and here in Verbruggen, haven't found this note, but I should check the sources at that point. But I remember that actually they were taken out with not with much ease, right? At least, but surely they weren't charged by simple, just after not having been softened up, right? And considered cavalry charges were done very, very carefully. Like when the English will have to attack the Scottish schiltrons, we'll start literally going around the schiltron to see what spot the weakest part of the line, with the guys inside the schiltron kind of shifting in parallel with the cavalry to counter them in case of attack. So it's what happened in the north is less. It's somewhat clear, but at the same time, we might have known more. A special mention I didn't say it for the system of royal preservance of Philip Augustus, as we've seen he was cautiously, gradually brought into battle, where he actually risked his own life. So with these guys that can't even attack knights and try to stab them in the eyelids or in the other part, so that, however, still shows that the King of France had to take part in combat, and if he would, right, this was a great battle for the domination of Europe, and he behaved like a proper king was. But there is still this sense that the guy has to be preserved, differently from, like, even for Otto, we've seen that his bodyguard behaved well, but he charged apparently together with all the others initially, whereas with Philip Augustus, the thing went more calibrated. And I can't think of other aspects. Of course, we could talk for a long time about this wall formations and how, even in comparison with other battles, but I think this is not the objective of the video. And actually, we'll stop it here. I promise I will make at some point a video on the Battle of Bouvines and its historical significance. We may do it actually even, well, I don't know, really, it will happen. But it probably a video on the significance of the battle just in terms of consequences, per se, right? And then we could naturally extend it to the, what every single country, lived through after this battle. And in a way, we have already done it. As you know, I created a playlist on medieval France, medieval Germany, medieval Britain and Ireland, medieval Italy. So if you want to see what this battle actually triggered, I actually made a video, which is from to Bouvines. I don't know how it's called. It's in the Holy Roman Imperial video. I can playlist. Excuse me. I can search for it. But anyway, it's there, and it talks a bit about this stuff. And it talks about Bouvines and what this will. I made several videos on the French monarchy during the 13th century, so you can already find something. But I will do something more eventually about it. And I confess I was a bit emotioned to make this video, in the sense that I didn't know how it would turn out. I had never looked directly, at the Battle of Bouvines in this. I had actually read Verbruggen. I had read actually fair amount of stuff on Bouvines, but I still hadn't. Until you don't explain it to others, you don't focus it, you don't pose yourself the problems that you have when you have to make an exposition to learn something for an explanation. So I didn't know how to do it. Instead, it turned out fairly well, right? And the video, it's even shorter than what I think it should be. There are probably, too many details that I missed in a way, but I tried to be, essential, because I know, after all, this battle is, it's really about this, right? It's not that there are some vital details now that I didn't tell you, but there are lots of other things that just an in-depth study of, I repeat it, of weeks, if not of months, can lead to. And also, as always, that there must be a general understanding of how these guys fought. I mean, you should study all, the wars between France and England since, I don't know, the 1180s, and to get here what the deal is, right? Because it's very risky to detach a battle from its military background, because you lack certain points that actually you can say, oh, you see, in this battle happened this thing that maybe on a minor scale had happened in another place, in another occasion here, similarly, and that helps you understanding. So I have searched even some for other article, but I found mostly readings of the battle significance per se. There are these problems of the numerical strength interpretation, even some tactics, but generally speaking, I've never read a study that actually, shows you source by source the Battle of Bouvines, like with hundreds of pages, and I will have to search for it, because, as you were saying, this is really the most important battle in the Middle Ages, right? In terms of consequences, and it's very exemplary of 13th century warfare as a whole. I can say it's a standard battle. To me, the standard battle has become, maybe because I deepened it in some other context, that the in-depth formation. This is the linear formation is kind of single line formation is kind of more interesting and less typical in a way. But what happens on the field is typical 13th century warfare in a nutshell. Right, the chivalric dominance, but still the subordination, but still growth and presence and actual nastiness of infantry. Right at this point. And and even about the national components of the armies, we have seen things that we will have to discuss further for every context. As you know, I will cover, I plan at least to cover basically all Western medieval warfare in details. Like in terms of every type of trooper and every kind of army organization, every type of battle, every battle. And therefore we'll cover gradually. Maybe we didn't talk much about this times, but we will do it, right? It's just we've talked about something else in the meanwhile, but I think I told you even here what are the national cliches about these troops and what they represent overall. But for the rest, these armies compositions were pretty standard, right? There is a bit of an ethnical touch with a bit more of infantry from the Flemish side, the Brabants and pikemen. For the rest, knights especially were pretty much the same, right? And probably infantry had a greater importance. We can't fully focus here because all the camera stay on the knights, right? And this is the concept of the battle after all. And the infantryman come into play just if it's necessary, right? And this naturally reveals his importance in this specific case. Anyhow, I would end it here for today. I think we have talked enough, and once again we'll talk again about Bouvines, but I was glad at least we described it from a tactical point of view. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.